Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's NKBA KBIS design webinar, Streamlined Lighting, a Consistent, Repeatable Path to Illumination. As we continue our theme of lighting and design for May, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Hardware Resources for sponsoring this month's Design and Business webinar series. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Keith Clark, National Sales Specialist with Task Lighting and Hardware Resources. Keith, please take it away.
Thank you very much. So, as I mentioned, my name is Keith Clark. So I'm the National Sales Specialist for Task Lighting. So my job is to get out, come see you guys. I go all over the country and I get to meet lots of fun faces. So it's always a good thing to do. But my goal here today is to, as the presentation mentions, right, I'm going to try and lay out something that is consistent and repeatable for those of you who are looking to get into lighting. Maybe you've, started at one time, you tried it, it didn't go well, you've had an issue there, or you're just getting started. You have never done lighting. It's not something that you've introduced to, or you haven't tried it before. It's been too scary. I mean, for lack of a better word, right? It's definitely different than a lot of other things that go into the kitchen. You may be familiar with, doing the decorative lighting or, can lights and things like that. But the actual functional lighting, under cabinet stuff, in cabinet stuff, all the other stuff that goes around the house, it can, I know, feel daunting. So I'm going to try and leverage the meetings that I've had with experts, all over the country, the things that they do right, the things that makes it feel like it's easy to them when it seems so daunting to everybody else, and kind of convert that into hopefully something that is palatable, right? Something that you can use and repeat and be able to finally add lighting onto your own business and give you that extra, that extra avenue for revenue. The ways that we're going to kind of do that is we're going to go through basically a set of things that I see time and time again that these experts, they repeat and they know and have on lock. So to look kind of through the agenda, the first thing here is going to be just knowing the core components of a low voltage lighting installation, right? And it seems like there's a whole lot, and there's a lot of different ways you can configure a lighting installation. But the cool thing is you can kind of boil everything down to 4 or 5 major components, which I think is really nice. And so I'll kind of lay those out for you and give you a look at it and how I see it. From there, we'll talk about a couple things that I think are important on every job for you to be aware of. Kelvin temperature, which is how warm or how cool the lights are. We'll go into more detail about that. But basically, what is the atmosphere you're creating with the lights? Followed by product quality. What is the level of quality that you should expect to be putting into an installation? What is it customers going to expect versus what you need to have? Then we'll talk about some of the things that the experts use to kind of stay on top of the curve, stay ahead of everyone else. And, one of those things is going to be a design support specialist. Design teams are so useful, and we'll kind of go through all the reasons why they help, how they save time, all that good stuff like that, before finally touching into something that I don't think a lot of people get into, which is some entry-level troubleshooting. And there's a lot of benefit to be had by just knowing the basics, just knowing enough to visually recognize, like, oh, I can see what's wrong here and we can fix this really easily. That way you save yourself time, from calling in experts or calling all these things. And together, the 5 topics outlined here are kind of the things that I see the guys that make lighting look easy really on top of. And so that's kind of what I wanted to put together into this presentation for you and hopefully give you something that's really valuable and something that you'll use. I hope that's the goal, right? So, we'll start with the basics. We'll go into the Kelvin, the quality. We'll go into the services, and then we'll head towards some troubleshooting observations. Starting with core lighting components. So I mentioned 4 to 5. We'll talk about light sources, which is the most obvious one, of course. But there are also things to consider like power supplies, connection wire and connectors, which can sometimes be looped together, and then a method of control. So every way that you can configure a lighting job is going to come down to some combination of these 5 components, however it ends up looking. And there are lots of different ways to get there, but ultimately this is what you kind of need to know and expect. So when you're checking off your boxes, you're going through your mental checklist of, did we get everything here? These are the ones that you need. So that's where we'll start. The first one being light sources. Okay, so the common light sources that you see in, whether it be a kitchen, whether it be bathrooms, closets, things like that, of course, you'll see tape lighting. That's probably the one that you see the most these days when using a functional situation like under cabinet, in cabinet, toe kick or in a closet, things like that, you see a lot of tape lighting. And so comes off the roll, you cut it to size, you put it in place. This is probably the most common one that you've seen. But to take that a step farther, you've got what we call a linear fixture. And that effectively is taking some sort of tape lighting, some sort of linear lighting like that, and placing it into a housing or a channel, right? You may see it as, aluminum with a frosted lens. You may see it as something like what's pictured here, where you've got a plastic housing that's in a black or a white or something like that, with all the internal components that looks more finished. It's typically going to have end caps. It's going to have some way to mount, whether it be with screws or with clips. And, that would be kind of your next step. Another one that you see is going to be like a puck light. And so you may see these surface mounted. You may see them recessed. Sometimes people will put them into cabinets with glass shells, and they shine from the top all the way through to the bottom. Some people will put them beneath shelving, things like that. I've seen them, under cabinets several times as well. So they're pretty versatile. You don't see them quite as much anymore, but they are definitely still around and they have their place. The last one that you're seeing, and this one is just one that's on the rise, that you're suddenly seeing appear in a lot more places. You're seeing a lot of different brands offer their own version, their own flavor of this product now, and that's silicone encased lighting, or as some people might call it, neon lighting. Of course, it's still LED encased in silicone, but because of the kind of curved and looped appearance with that continuous look, that's where people kind of draw the name from. So what that is effectively kind of a hybrid combination of a tape light and a linear fixture, where basically you have a jacket, you have a frosted and continuous appearance without the dots, the same thing that you would get with a linear fixture, but that is now in a flexible housing. And that flexible housing may also be cuttable, much like a tape light would be. And so you kind of get the ability to come off of a roll, cut it to size, put it in place, feeling of a tape light with that more in a housing frosted lens appearance of a linear fixture. And so that's kind of how it's setting itself apart. And if I were going to look at these three kind of as your ones that you see quite commonly, tape lighting, of course, is great for your budget-friendly customers. That's always going to kind of be your price competitive option, where you can get the lighting in there without being over the top on pricing. The other two are going to be a step up. They may be a little more, a little less than each other, depending on who what company you're working with. But generally speaking, one of them is going to prioritize a fully finished, rigid fixture that installs and goes in place, and it has that look, whereas the other one prioritizes a low profile, a minimalistic look, while still having that flexibility and finished look all together in one place. And that's what you kind of get with that, the silicone encased lighting. So it really, really kind of depends on preference on those, but these are kind of the four that you're going to see most commonly. Of course, there are other options, right? So those are going to be your light sources. Next up, you're going to have power supplies. And so typically with a low voltage, with a functional lighting situation, you're going to have 120 volts being converted down to any number of voltages, but the two most common are going to be 12 or 24 volt. Those are the ones you see the most. And I would say you see a pretty significant trend in the market towards 24 volts, just because there are some advantages that you get. It doesn't cost really much different, or in much cases, much more. You can do a little more with it. So the market kind of seems to be trending that way from what I see when I'm out there. But with that power supply, like I said, you're converting down to low voltage, but there are different form factors. You can have one that's plugged in, just as simple as it plugs into a receptacle and provides power that way. You can get one that is hardwired, where the electrician comes in and does a hardwired connection, and then you run to the low voltage from there. You can have them in varying different sizes, right? So you could say that the factor or the word for the size of a power supply would be watts. How many watts is the power supply, right? So you can have something very small all the way up to hundreds of watts on one power supply, just depending on where you're at. Now, let me remind you, typically by most codes in a residential situation with 12 volts, you're going to be capped at a 60 watt power supply. And in 24 volts, you're going to be capped at a 100 watt power supply. Now, that's strictly in residential, not in commercial as much, right? But just something to keep in mind. Now, the final factor here is going to be dimmability, right? There are different ways you can configure this power supply. You're going to have either, one that's just purely a power supply, it does nothing else. You might have one that dims on the output side or the low voltage side. So say you're 24 volts out in a particular power supply, may connect to some sort of dimming switch that controls it from there. Then on the opposite side of that, you may have one that does the dimming on the input side, the 120 volt side. So coming from say a wall dimmer switch, like a Lutron style slider dimmer, right? That would be one that you use with an input, like a 120 volt side dimmable power supply. So different ways to configure it, but ultimately it comes down to having some sort of power supply to connect to the lighting. And that's going to be, preference for how your installer wants to handle things most of the time. Okay, next up, I said that I would kind of group these two together. So you have your connection wire and your connectors. To me, two different separated components, but in some cases you see them together. The big idea here is there are two leading philosophies when it comes to this type of lighting. The first one would be pre-manufactured leads, where you've got your connectors pre-attached to a wire that's a length of wire, whatever it may be. And those may be plug and play, where you plug one into a power supply and then it plugs into your lights on the other side, or you have some sort of quick connection there. But the idea is all the wire and connectors comes together in one piece. And the advantage of this is it may be a plug and play where you can plug things in. The disadvantage of that would be now you've got maybe 10 different lengths of connectors, and you've got to plan for what length of connector you need, and you may have some excess wire that you've got to hide and tuck away. The second major philosophy is going to be using just a connector with standard, connection wire. And the popular gauges for that I note are 18, 20, and 22 when it comes to a low voltage situation. This way, the wire comes on a spool, you roll it off and you cut it to the exact size that you want, and then you connect it to your connector. The downside being, of course, that your installer is probably going to have to strip that wire and insert it into a connector manually. So one more step on the installer side, one less step on the planning side, where you don't have to plan for the right sizes, because you just send the spool of wire, they roll it out and cut it to size. So really, it just comes down to two philosophies, and you'll kind of lean into whichever one that you prefer. Additionally, on this slide, you'll see different connector types. So there are some, fold over connectors where, you've got these terminals inside and you snap it tight to make sure it stays shut. You may have a screw terminal connection where you tighten a screw down onto tape light or lighting that's in a fixture or whatever it may be. Or you may have something that's more simple, like a barrel connection, where you're literally just taking a male-female barrel connector and just popping them together. So there are different ways to put these together, but ultimately you'll have some sort of connection wire, either on a spool or in a pre-manufactured lead, and a connector, of course, to do the same thing. So two schools of thought, but they both end up with, the same result there. And then, of course, our fifth and final component here is going to be your method of control. I would say this is the one that varies the most. There are lots and lots and lots of options on how you're going to control the lights. I'll just go through a few here, right? You've got your standard wall switch, just your on and off toggle switch that you see in a lot of homes to control various, different types of lighting throughout the home. To take that a step further, you may have your wall dimmer switch. I mentioned this earlier, like a Lutron style switch that's got a toggle, but it also has a dimmer slider that's next to it. So you can slide up and down and change the brightness of the lights. You see those quite a bit. You may have a wireless controller. The wireless controller is going to be, able to move around or handle things remotely. It could also fit into like a standard decor switch plate and look just like a dimmer on the wall. So that's another option. You may use some sort of sensors. There are so many different types of sensor switches and things like that, right? So pictured here, I've got a door sensor switch where when you open this cabinet door, the lights turn on. It detects that the door is open, the lights come on. But you could have motion sensor switches that detect, if you walk into a room and it detects motion, boom, the lights come on. I'm seeing a lot of that these days, actually. You see it with pathway lighting. Night lighting is becoming a big thing where people will illuminate like a toe kick in a kitchen or, like I said, along a pathway to light things up, maybe beneath a vanity. Or now you even see motion sensor lighting in a closet quite commonly too, where you walk in, the motion's detected, boom, the lights come on in the closet. So that's another way that you can control things. So there's just so many different sensors and switches and things like that. But that's just falls into your method of control. There's just many different ways to do that. Next up, you've got smart home devices. Some people are now able to tie all their lighting into Alexa or Google or Philips Hue or whoever it is that that you're using as a smart home thing. That way, you can get voice activated lighting. You can tell it to turn on and off, to change the brightness, to change the Kelvin temperature. Lots of different ways to control the lighting through a smart home device now. And also, those often will have access to an app control as well, where you can pull out your phone and control the lights through an app. And you may never even have to do anything but, just use your phone for your lights. And then the final one would be like a whole home control system, right? So that's something like you may have heard of Control 4 or Lutron Homeworks or something like that. But this is a dedicated structural system that runs throughout the house, and everything ties back into that. All the lighting, one way or another. Functional lighting is no different than this. You may think that it's not possible to have everything unified, but it definitely is if you're looking at the right system. So something to consider. They're very expensive, but depending on the customer, they may be what they're going to go with. And so it's all possible to tie everything back in together that way. That would be your methods of control, right? So let's kind of look back and summarize. Like that's a lot of that. We covered a lot there, but everything boils back down to those 5 components, right? You're going to pick your light. You're going to, that you've got to convert the power down to low voltage. You've got to use some sort of connection wire and connectors to get there, to get the light illuminated. And then you got to choose your method of control, sensors, switches, whatever it may be. Everything comes back down to those 5 main components. When I talk to experts, the guys that are good at this, the guys that make lighting look easy, most of the time they find that one thing that works really well for them and they stick with it, right? And so they say, this is the standard offering. Maybe, they'll pick out a particular light that they like, housing they like, Kelvin temperature they like, which we'll talk about Kelvin temperature here in a second. But they'll pick something that they like, and that's kind of their bread and butter, and they go to that. Again, we're coming back to that repeatability, the ability to do this on autopilot so it takes less of your time and you're able to make that revenue. And so this is what they get really good at, is finding that repeatable source of illumination in these places. Okay. Now, I mentioned Kelvin temperature. Okay. So how warm or how cool is the lighting? You can kind of see the juxtaposition of the images here, a warm versus a cool of the same space, to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. This is going to be a highly, highly preferential thing, right? This is going to be, it comes down to what the end user really wants to see in this installation. And it also depends on what other lighting has been put in, right? You've got, your can lights, you've got maybe decorative lighting of various shapes and sizes and Kelvin temperatures. So you may want to line it up and match it with that. I mentioned on here tunable white, because this is something that I see a lot of now. A tunable white light allows you to adjust the Kelvin temperature. So whereas you may have a static temperature, like someone picks 3000 Kelvin, a warmer light, and that's what they stick with. Sure. A tunable white light allows you to change from warm to cool, anywhere in between. And that allows, the end customer to kind of pick and choose what they want, how they want their space to look. And it's going to dial back on those callbacks where you have somebody call in and say, look, I really liked this when we talked about it, but now it doesn't look good anymore and I'm not happy. So with tunable white, you never worry about that. They're just picking what they like. They can adjust that on the fly and dial it in the way they want. Then, of course, you've got your dimmability versus tunability. And so I'll tell you now that I think that the standard these days is to have full range dimmable control and tunable control. You shouldn't have to sacrifice anything there. So if you've got 2700 Kelvin, or you've got 5000, or you've got 4000, whatever your Kelvin temperature is, you should be able to have full brightness control at any of those levels. And so that makes it easier on you, because you're not worried about, I'm going to lose brightness if I go down in Kelvin temperature, so on and so forth. So I think that's become the standard that you should expect. So again, let's go back to kind of what I'm seeing a lot of. I see a good mix, but I would say the majority of people who are looking for repeatability, looking for ease of use when it comes to adding lighting, I'm seeing a shift towards tunable white, because it allows them to, that decision becomes the customer's decision, and it's something that they can change, and less callbacks mean less work, right? And it's less time invested in each project, so you can move on to the next big thing, right? You're trying to focus on, what cabinets, what doors, what hardware. There's a million decisions that you have to make, and being able to remove Kelvin temperature from that equation is just time back in your hands. So I see that a lot. The alternative is sometimes I'll see people say, I like 3000 Kelvin, like that's the most popular one that I see out there. And some people say 3000 Kelvin is my standard offering, unless somebody tells me otherwise. And that's a fine way to approach it as well, right? It just gives you one consistent temperature that you're planning your designs around. And if the customer says, I want something else, then so be it. That's what they do then, right? So going back to that, I see if you're going to pick one, 3000 is still the most common that I see. 4000 has come up in popularity in recent years. I would say that one is quite popular. 3000 being a more warm temperature, 4000 being a more kind of neutral white, right? A very, very kind of standard clean white light. You've also got, you see 2700 Kelvin sometimes. That one's quite warm. That's more like an incandescent bulb that you would see of old. And then 5,000 Kelvin, I don't see a lot. That one is so cool that it's almost blue in appearance. So less common, but it's still out there here and there. So 3,000 is a good default, but tunable white really solves all of your issues for you there. Okay, next up, let's talk about product quality, and something that I see experts come back to time and time again. This statement that I have here, I truly, I would stand by. There is, of course, avenues to get ultra cheap lighting, whether it's online, whether it's in the store, wherever it may be. Ultra cheap lighting definitely exists out there. However, oftentimes it is designed for a hobbyist or someone who's willing, not intending to have this in there for the long haul. They may, be fleet. They've changed this, changed that. Professional grade lighting is where I would say that you should go for this. I go and see the customers all the time, and I hear, sometimes I'll hear, well, I've been using this particular product and I haven't had any issues. And, they'll say that they'll use it 5, 10, 15 jobs, but usually I end up getting a call that says, no, something went wrong. The support wasn't there. We just didn't have what we needed, and I'm ready to make a change. So I'll say product quality is extremely important when it comes to something like this, because I'm sure you might be able to save a few dollars up front on an installation, but when something goes wrong and suddenly you don't have the support, the customer service, you don't have a warranty, then you start to run into problems. And let's not forget, you've got to call the contractor back out there, or the installer, or whoever it may be. Those are man hours that are being lost, and that can get really expensive really quickly, especially if it doesn't get fixed on the first time around and you're going back to the same job site multiple times. This is what runs so many people away from lighting to begin with, is having a bad experience like this, where like something went wrong on a job, everything cratered, and you threw your hands up in there and said, nope, this is not for me. Well, if you have the quality lighting and you have the support service that comes along with that, that helps you solve a lot of these problems. So I would look at these, more reputable companies, people who made a name for themselves when it comes to quality, and I would highly recommend you move that way. You get warranty support, several years of warranty, you get customer service, and it just really makes such a difference, and you will notice that difference pretty immediately once you start using that. So let's talk about that next degree of service, and that's going to come through the use of a design service. If you're working with one of these, these companies that have established a name for themselves, a lot of times they're going to have a design support team, which we call, design support specialist or design service, and they're going to be there, because that's what they do, is lighting all day, every day, and they can help you with your planning. So I cannot recommend this enough, especially if you're just getting into it or you've had a bad experience in the past. This is like your autopilot mode for something that becomes repeatable and easy to manage on every project. Design services, you're going to submit a project layout to them and let them lay things out. You'll give them your, whether it is your elevation, whether it's a 2020 layout, or even sometimes a sketch or something like that will do, as long as it has sufficient information. What you'll get back from them most of the time is a completed layout, and that layout may have itemized product lists. It could be able to convert that to an order. But the most important thing you'll get is that design that you can then turn and hand back to your installer and say, look, this is what it should look like. This is where everything should go. This is what piece goes where. Hopefully everything is labeled and done right. And then you get, something that's high quality that saved you time and saves your installer time and ends up with less hassle because you've done it through a professional service. So this is typically going to be a free service. I recommend finding somebody who offers it for free. And turnaround times typically aren't as long as you would think. They can be as low as 24 to 48 hours. Sometimes they range up a little more than that, but a good service gets it back to you quickly. So I cannot stress enough how useful they are when it comes to having a repeatable process. Especially, if you get in with a specific designer and they learn what you like, man, you can really churn out some stuff really quickly. And so that's what I hear a lot of the experts say is like, oh, I've got, so-and-so is my designer at this company. They know me, they know what I want backwards and forwards. And we just go, we turn and burn on these designs and we get them out there. And that's how they're able to offer lighting on every job consistent. When it comes to using the design service, what do we want to have prepared for them? How can we streamline that information and get back the best possible result the first time, the first try? Okay. Let me say dimensions are absolutely critical. You got to have them. This is how they're going to, first calculate how many feet of lighting are going to be involved. They're going to calculate what fits where. If you've got specific cabinet sizes and you're using, say, a linear fixture, then you've got to know what size fixtures to fit that cabinet. So dimensions are far and away the most important thing that you can submit. Following that, you've got what type of lighting that you are wanting in there. And you may not have the answer to these questions your first few times around as you're working in to try and identify that. That's typically fine. You could tell them, I just want under cabinet lighting. Please make a recommendation. And that'll be good enough. That'll be good to go. They can give you different ways to look at that and different, perspectives on how people lay things out. So you're gonna, choose what type of lighting. You're gonna choose what types of specifics on controls that you need. First, that would be what sensors and switches, et cetera, whatever you want to use there. So we've talked about the myriad of options that you have in that regard. You may just tell them, I want to put this on a wall dimmer switch, and they can choose, they can control the brightness. Or if you're using a tunable white light, you want to make sure that you're using a tunable white control along with that. Various things that come into play there. That's all good extra information. And so then behind that, you've got where is the power going to be located? And again, you may not know. The power could be in, say you've got a microwave cabinet, and you know that within that microwave cabinet, you're going to have an extra receptacle there. Well, maybe you just want to get a power supply and plug it straight into that additional receptacle and go from there. Maybe code says you got to have a dedicated circuit for your microwave. That's fine too. You can find other places to do this. You can have the electrician put power above the crown, and create a hiding place up there above the top of the cabinets. Some people will put it, beneath the sink next to the garbage disposal. So there are different ways to lay this out. If you need recommendations, I highly recommend leaning into the design service and letting them tell you some of these places. If you've got your layout, they can even point out and say, look, I see opportunities here and here and here. So again, all good information to have and submit when you use a design service. Dimensions, first and foremost, all these other questions answered. Helps, not required on the first go round. Okay, let's look at an example, something that you could submit versus something that you might expect to get back. Okay. So first, let's say layout that you've submitted is here. So this is a very simplified one. So you can kind of get a look at what you're seeing here. There, of course, are dimensions labeled. On this one, you've got, your microwave, your oven, stove top, all that is labeled as well, not necessarily required, but you can also see this particular person has highlighted where they want the lighting, right? They're going to have a light rail. They're going to drop that lighting behind that. And this is what they've asked for a layout on and a suggestion for this particular instance. So this is a good example of something that would be submitted. Like I said, you can go more complicated, more simple. A good design services team can handle all this. I mean, some design services team handle spec work. They can do massive, complicated projects as well. So don't be afraid to at least give that a run. Now let's look and see kind of what you would get back coming behind that. All right, so here is that same, the same layout, now dropped in with lighting so you can kind of see what comes in here. In this particular case, this person went with kind of an a la carte situation where they ordered a tape light, but also the channel to come with it. So in this instance, they're going to make their own fixtures effectively. They're going to cut channel to size, put the tape lighting in it, and create that frosted look on this particular fixture. Now, let's look closely. Okay, so let's move back to what we were talking about previously. This particular job, you're going to have the 5 core components, right? A power supply, in this case, 24 volts. In this particular case, plug-in, because look, they're using the receptacle above the microwave in this example. You're going to have your method of control, which in this case is your wireless receiver and controller pair. These two talk to each other wirelessly. You got your wire, you've got your connector, you've got your tape light. Okay. And in this case, the connector and tape light will be installed into that channel to create a linear fixture. So this is kind of an interesting one where ordering things individually, you may not order the assembled fixture with the lighting in it, but you're still ending up with that result. All right. So we're also showing, mounting clips and things like that. But again, the idea is this is what you get back, and you can hand this straight to an installer and get something, high quality that comes from that. All right. So before we talk troubleshooting, we're just going to go back and summarize kind of all the different things that we've covered, right? So we've learned kind of our core 5 products. We've talked about what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about on every job, like Kelvin temperature, product quality of what we're putting into these jobs. And then, of course, leveraging a design service to take all those selections and convert that into an itemized list with a layout that we can use then to get the product installed. Okay, the next big thing here that is going to be troubleshooting. And I think this is an important thing to kind of touch on, right? I mentioned it, I kind of, hinted at this early on in the presentation, but being able to, quickly visually identify something is going to really set you apart when it comes to making this easy, making this repeatable, like we talked about. You'll be surprised. Contractors will surprise you all the time. If you're using an electrician, stuff like that, they don't always know a lot about low voltage lighting. So if you can identify it yourself, that's awesome. That's a great thing to do. Okay, so for troubleshooting basics, right? Low voltage lighting doesn't always require an electrician to look at things. You can visually identify some common items. We kind of talked about this. So let's look now at some different pattern recognition things that you can see and observe and say, oh, that's what's going on there. And if you can do that, then that will save you time on callbacks, on calling in experts, on spending time on the phone trying to diagnose exactly what's happening. So I'm hoping that we can talk and train some recognition here to set you, give you that advantage. Okay, first situation here. This is going to be the issue is the lights are just flashing, right? You power everything up, everything's connected, and all of a sudden the lights are flashing and they're just on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off in a repeated pattern. This one is pretty straightforward. It's one of the ones that I see most commonly. And this is just a safety function of the power supply. And it is telling you, I'm overloaded. You got too much on me. There's too much lighting, whatever it may be. I'm overloaded and this is not sustainable. I'm going to burn up. Okay. So that's a really easy one to identify. Like if someone says like, look, my lights are just flashing on and off and I don't know what's going on. Just think, okay, we've got too much load here. I will tell you, the experts that I talk to, they're always oversizing their power supply by 10 to 20%, right? So if they recognize this is going to be a lot of lighting, they'll divide it up. Maybe they'll take it and cut it into 2 or 3 sections instead of one big section. They start to identify. And again, this is something a design service can help you with too. This is just a simple one-line request to say like, hey, don't cut it close with the power supplies. Add another power supply. You can just upsize the power supply potentially. Like if you've already got everything installed and you don't want to go back and rewire, just look at upsizing that power supply to give you that extra coverage that you need. Just remember keeping in mind your codes and limits on things like that. Worst case scenario, you may have to cut back, a particular space on the lighting if there's really no other option. But usually there's a way that you can manage it, whether it's adding, splitting a run up or adding another power supply. There's a way to go about doing that. So that's where I would start if you're recognizing that particular pattern in the lights. Okay, next up. In this situation, your lights are going to be turning themselves off. And I don't mean they're flashing. I'm talking about the lights come on, everything looks beautiful. You're like, yes, we nailed this. And then all of a sudden, boom, the lights shut themselves off. And they may come off for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and they may come right back on. And then after a few minutes, they go off. The first place I'm going, if I recognize this happening on a job site, is to the power supply. And if that power supply feels hot, then you've got an issue. There's going to be a couple of different things that could go wrong here. One, you don't have enough ventilation. In extreme situations, there really, maybe a power supply that's packed into an area that's too tight. But remember, what that power supply is doing is producing a lot of heat, converting a lot of energy. So it's taking that 120 volts and converting it down. That takes a lot of energy, and it's producing excess heat, and it's got to dissipate that heat. So if you've got it in a tight space where there's not a lot of ventilation, then it could overheat. It absolutely could. And that's a safety mechanism with the power supply. It says, oh man, I'm too hot. I don't want to burn up. I'm going to shut the lights down for a few minutes until I can catch up, and I'm going to cool down, and then we'll turn the lights back on. And so, in extreme situations, I've seen where somebody, put a power supply up in the ceiling, and then suddenly there's ceiling insulation sitting on top of that power supply. And insulation is exactly what it's designed to do, is retain, create a heat barrier. And so when there's nowhere for heat to go, it's going to shut that power supply down. If you've got it in a really tight space where there's not a lot of room or ventilation, same thing happens there. So definitely think about that when it comes to your power. Going inside a microwave cabinet, you got plenty of space in there typically to dissipate heat, right? So going above the crown, going, in different spaces, you just want to plan to have that space for heat dissipation. Also be checking, if you've got a fan or something like that on the power supply. If that fan fails, that power supply is going to overheat. I've seen it happen. I've definitely seen it happen. You go in, you've got a section of light that just clicks out, and what do you know? The power supply fan has failed. Maybe there was dust on the job site. Maybe it's got something lodged in the fan. Maybe there's just a technical failure with the power supply. If it's not working and it's designed to work that way, then that will shut those lights off and you've got a big problem. So just something to keep an eye out for when you're seeing this situation. You got to ventilate those power supplies. It's such a big deal. Okay, the lights are flickering kind of randomly or inconsistently. So as opposed to our first example where the lights are flashing on, off, and kind of like a repeated pattern, if the lights look jittery, and it may be that they work fine, that they look good 90% of the time, but every now and then you see this little just jitter or snap. And it may be that your installer finished the installation, said everything looks great, and walked off the job site, and suddenly you get a call the next day and like, oh, the lights don't quite look right. I can see, these little jitters or these little flickers in the light. 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a poor connection somewhere. And, really and truly, this can be an ego thing. I've seen it happen before. You get in, your installer says, there's no way. But I've walked on a job sites myself where that was the case and found a loose connection. So you just got to go through this, check your connections, make sure that nothing is loose. All it takes is, one thing that's come loose, whether it's the flap on a folding connector or, something, a wire that's popping, trying to pop out. It'll all cause it. And so, my tip for finding this quickly is to tap the connections. Go to your connectors and just tap, create some vibration. You'll start to notice when the flicker gets more significant. If you're able to actively reproduce the flicker, you're getting closer. And until you're right on top of it, you may tap that connector, boom, you see immediately flicker. And that's where you should start your investigation. Start your check that connection and make sure everything is good. It can happen, loose connections can happen to the best of us. It's happened to me doing an install. You just have to go back and fix it. So just be on the lookout for that. It's definitely something that happens. And it can also be the case if, maybe you've got, cabinet to cabinet lighting. And, maybe 2 of those cabinets are not lit. The first 2 cabinets are lit. The second 2 are not lit. I can about guarantee you that connection between those 2 is loose. And maybe something's come out, a wire popped out or something like that. And now you got to go and touch that up and fix it. But that should be your resolution to that. But like I said, I just harp on the fact that don't be that person that says, no, this can't happen to me. My installations are perfect every time, because I promise it can. You got to be willing to go look at stuff like that. Okay. In a situation where the lights are flickering only when dimming up or down. Okay. This is going to be different from the last scenario where you may not even touch anything. And every now and then you just see like a little flicker in the lights. This is going to be like if I'm specifically controlling the lights, if I'm dimming up and down, or if I dim down to a particular setting and all of a sudden the lights start to flicker. Quite often I have seen that this ties back to the power supply. Either the power supply is maybe not ideal to use with a particular dimmer that you've picked out. It could be a couple different things, but usually something is up with that power supply and it's just not communicating well with that dimmer and it's causing that particular flicker. So that's where I would start. Investigate that power supply, check compatibility, make sure that you don't need a replacement or have something that's faulty that you need to go back and have replaced. It's just one of those things. Not all dimmers and power supplies talk too well to each other. I wish it was a perfect world and perfect scenario like that. You've got some really, really high-end power supplies companies that avoid this. And then you've got some, power supply companies that don't. And that's all there is to it. So, look for quality. I go back to the quality thing when you're talking about a power supply. Look for that. But of course, when you see that flicker when dimming, just think it's probably going to have to do with the power supply. All right. And then the final one that I'll cover here today is a situation where this is an important one. The lights may come on just for a brief second, but then they shut themselves off immediately. I'm talking about, it could be you just see a spark of light and then boom, the lights shut off. This is going to be usually a situation where you've got a short. And again, the power supply might actually click whenever this happens. That's another safety feature. In case you haven't picked up on this, good power supplies are going to have a lot of safety features built into them, whether it's overburdened, being overburdened or being overheated, or if it detects a short in the system. When I say short, if you're not familiar with that term, basically you know that the electrical current is meant to flow in a particular path. If there is a disruption in that path, or if there is something that the power supply can detect has gone wrong with that path, it will shut itself off purely out of self-defense. And that's just something that is a good power supply does. So it may click as a warning. It may, you may hear like a clicking noise of the power supply hitting a full reset and shutting those lights off, and say that's basically it telling you like, hey, this is not okay. We got a problem here. I need you to check this out. So that's something to look for there. And a short can be any number of things. Okay. Here are a few examples. One, you've got a pinched wire somewhere. Maybe you've bitten through the jacket of the wire and you've got exposed wire, and that wire is making contact with something. And that will, when the current is meant to be flowing through that wire and all of a sudden it's escaping through, some other path, that is going to trigger a short. Okay. And that's going to be a quite common situation that you run into with that. Another one could be you've got a wire that's come loose from a connection. Like maybe you have, if you're familiar with, stranded wire, basically that's a lot of little tiny wires that are all braided together, and it's used sometimes to connect low voltage lighting. Well, if even one of those little bitty tiny strands pops out and makes connection with another wire, then you got a problem. That's going to create a short. And so all of these things and more will turn those, shut that power supply down. But definitely if you hear that audible click, or if the lights come on and just immediately click off, that's what I would go looking for. Check your wire, make sure that there's no exposed wire underneath, make sure that jacket is still intact, and then check those connections to make sure you don't have any wires jumping out or anything going crazy like that. But that would be kind of your key go-to things to look at there. All right, let's circle back now. So this is going to be kind of all the way through what we've looked at, right? You've got your, understanding all your major components. You get that base knowledge down. You understand, no matter how you're configuring it, you're coming back to these 5 components. Next, you're going to make sure that you're using quality. You're going to make sure that you have features, potentially like tunable white, things like that allow you to streamline your process, make things easier. You're picking your Kelvin temperature you like, or you're using tunable white, and you're using quality components that are not going to come back and cause failures that are going to end up with you deviating from another project to go spend time on this, right? This is how we're going to tighten everything up, keep it nice and linear, so we're not going to branch out and have all these issues. Finally, we're going to use the design services support team to implement everything that you've picked out, get it into a layout, get it into something you can put in an installer's hands to complete. And now you've got your lighting installed. Then we're going to circle back. We're going to be able to do some quick and easy troubleshooting. I've given you the kind of the visual or auditory identifiers that the lighting is going to give you that says like, hey, I'm overburdened. Oh, there's a short. There's a problem here. There's a problem there. If you can identify those on top of that, save yourself the headaches of being on the phone for hours trying to figure out what's wrong with your lights. Now you're taking a process that you were worried was going to take hours and hours and hours of commitment, and you're just dialing it into something that is, as I've mentioned 100 times now, repeatable, consistent, and easy and streamlined. That's the goal, and that's going to be how we transition from a beginner level to from scared all the way up to I'm a pro at this. I can do this in my sleep. So I hope that this has been helpful. I really do. I really hope that you'll give it a try. You'll give it a go with wherever you decide to to get your lighting from, and that you find that support that you need along the way. I think that you will. There's so many companies that do it so well and give you that expertise that you need and that support that you need. So at this time, I'm going to open it up to the Q&A, and we'll hopefully get some good questions, and I'll be happy to help you however I can.
Thank you so much, Keith, for such a wonderful presentation. We appreciate you taking time to share this lighting expertise with us. We are going to hop into Q&A. Before we begin, we have a lot of questions, so we'll be staying as long as we have to try and get through as many as possible. If you do have questions as we're going through, please insert them in the Q&A box, not the chat, so we can make sure that we can answer them if we have time. Also, before we begin, this will be available for rewatch tomorrow after 5 p.m. Eastern at nkba.org if you miss any of the slides or the information. So Keith, whenever you are ready, we can go ahead and dive into the Q&A.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, let's go for that. So I'll kind of start here in the order that we received them and kind of go through this list. So the
Yeah,
first
I can
question,
actually help you out if you'd like,
oh
Keith, because I'd
yeah,
I'd like
that's
to.
awesome.
Perfect. I'd like to start with flickering since that was one of the last things that you touched on. We have a lot of questions about that.
Okay.
The first is, can you talk about flickering when LED strips are just turned off or flickers on a dimmer just before it turns on? Is that normal? So essentially, when the LED is turning on or turning off, is it normal to see a little bit of flicker as that power supply is changing?
Yeah, so this is going to kind of be, it depends on, of course, it always going to depend on, what power supply you're using, whose product it is. There's little minor variations. Unfortunately, not every power supply is created equal. But in a lot of cases, especially on power supplies when you dim down really low, like if you're at a low setting and right when you get to, there's basically a point where it goes from low to off. Sometimes you'll see a little flicker before that happens. That happens with a lot of power supplies I've seen, and it's just kind of, I guess, part of the programming or maybe a limitation of the internal components of a power supply. That when it gets really low like that, the current that it's pushing is just not quite strong enough to maintain that steadiness that you want to see. So that's one that I see a lot when it comes to dimming is when you get down low. If they're coming on when the lights have plenty of output, like if you're at like 75% or above and you see a little flicker before, then that could be just a little, maybe a little bug in the programming of that power supply. So I would look at maybe questioning, do I need to get a replacement or something like that? If it's not massively disruptive or not problematic or anything, that's one thing. But if it's really bothering the customer, then I would look into that.
Amazing. We have a few questions about the power supply fan. Are they usually loud? And someone also asked, is a power supply fan just a junction box?
Yeah. So let me start by saying this: the vast majority of power supplies do not have fans that are outward or audible or noticeable or anything like that. Most of them are using they have another alternative ways of dissipating heat. Either through the exterior casing or through a heat sink or something like that. Fans that or power supplies that have fans are usually going to be quite large in size, but on those that I've seen, the fan is usually not noticeably loud. I mean, maybe if you've got it in a cabinet and you stick your head in the cabinet, you might hear, the little whir of the fan. But generally speaking, unless it is just an absolute monster of a power supply, you shouldn't hear anything disruptive.
Perfect. I think that's helpful information for us to know.
Oh,
Can
and I'm sorry.
these,
Let me the second question you mentioned about
Great.
power supply being a junction box. So there's a difference between a power supply and a junction box. A power supply is typically found in a junction box, though. The junction box, the general electrical use of the term junction box is um, something where 120 volt power is connected. It's a box within which that is connected in a safe way, where basically you're keeping up to code and things like that. Since most power supplies are tying into 120 volts or what you would call line voltage, there is usually a compartment within there for that connection to be made. So the junction box, the power supply sits in the junction box. You connect the wires within that junction box, unless you're plugging it in which case you just plug it in and there's no junction box needed.
Okay, I think that's helpful. We appreciate you clarifying. Um, we have a few questions about troubleshooting issues as far as replacing when things burn out, how to know when something needs maybe a contractor or someone to come in. Can you provide any insight on how to escalate replacing or fixing things that are seeing issues?
Um, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, the first place you want to go is to where the item is warranted. If the item carries a warranty, then you want to go to them and see how willing are they to replace that item or at least walk you through troubleshooting or see something like that. Typically, I would go there before you bring your contractor back in. You start paying an hourly rate or something like that. Most you know upstanding lighting companies will have a good support system that you can go to and talk to and hopefully troubleshoot your problems. Like with our team, we solve a vast majority of problems before anybody ever needs to bring in a contractor back in for more than maybe just a single fix this connection or something like that.
Perfect. Someone asked, if you choose to use a whole home control system, are you limited to the brands of lights you use, or are all lights operable by a whole home system?
So it does depend on the system that you use. Some of them are more open than others are. Um, you have someone like, Control 4 has a lot of modules that will allow you to pick and choose which languages you're using. Basically, when I say a language, I'm talking about, does it use Bluetooth, or does it use Wi-Fi, or does it use radio frequency? There are lots of ways that you're communicating a signal one place or another. And Control 4 has done a really good job of kind of opening that up to being a very cross-compatible, whereas other systems are much less so.
Perfect. Someone asked, can these be integrated with Lutron switches like Caseta?
So Caseta is Lutron is very protective of their of their technologies. Caseta is a system that I would say is much more closed. It's a radio frequency system, and you kind of have to use their modules to happen. But if you're looking at the core 5 components we talked about, it's just another method of control. For the most part, you can use whatever light that you want to use with it, as long as you're using that Caseta, the Lutron product is your method of control. The light should integrate into that system pretty well.
Perfect. Our next question is, does task lighting have a suggested checklist or questionnaire for questions like controls, light types, lifestyle for us to use? These are great qualifiers you mentioned.
Yes. So task lighting, actually, we have what we call it our customer quote forms. Like if you're working directly with our design services team and you want to make sure that you're checking all the boxes, so you're making your full request and getting everything covered, that's where I would start, would be the customer quote form, because that's it gets everything in one place where you can tick the boxes and make sure you cover all your bases. And Alicia, I can get that to you if you want to share it with them after the presentation. Be happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a wonderful thing for us to include in the email that all attendees will receive. So we'll make sure to get that to everybody. Moving on to our next question, just chucking through these because we have a lot. Our next is, when you have glass wall cabinets with wood shelves, what looks best? Either to have the LED strips under the shelves pointing down, or the strips on top of the shelves pointing up. What has a more elevated look?
Yeah, I think this is going to be, it's going to be really, it's a visual preference, right? When you have a question that comes down to I guess the aesthetic aspect of something, everybody's going to have their own opinions. I personally have seen a lot more, well, I would say in my experience, I see more times the light going up than I do down these days. Just as, I don't know, people like this kind of up light glowing effect. Another one that I've seen with glass shelves that's really cool that you can do now that you've got products like like a silicone encased lighting, like a neon product where you've got a continuous line, is they will actually put that behind the glass shelf and then butt the shelf up against it, so the light actually kind of shines into the shelf, and the glass will really pick that up, and the whole thing will glow. So that's a really cool look if you can put the light actually behind that shelf and then come up against it.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. I like that. I like that perspective. A little bit different than what we've been seeing. Next, Jill asks, how do you get adjustable Kelvin tunable light? Just the bulb, or is it the whole system of control, the fixture, the lamp, or bulb?
Yeah, so what you would need as part of that system, so your light source would be, of course, a tunable white light source, one that can adjust, that it has the built-in capacity to adjust. Your wire and connectors would typically be close to the same in most situations. They may vary slightly. Your power supplies would still be the same, and then your method of control for that would require that you have some way to, of course, control Kelvin temperature. For specifically, like what Task does is we've got a wireless controller that talks to a receiver, and that wireless controller will adjust both the brightness and the Kelvin temperature of the lights. So it's kind of a different set of products that you would use when it comes to the light source and the method of control. Most everything else stays the same, though.
Perfect. Josepha asks, do you see regional differences in temperature preferences or other areas? For example, Seattle versus Scottsdale. I'm guessing based off of seasons and climates and things like that.
Yeah, that's actually a really cool question, because the answer is so interesting to me, going everywhere. Yes, I absolutely see a regional difference in what lighting that people prefer. I was actually in Scottsdale a few weeks ago, and the guys there were telling me that everybody wants 3000K right now. They want something that's warm but not incandescent, right? I was in New England 4 weeks ago, and they wanted 2700. Everybody, I do see a regional preference on that. The other preference that I see is what what is the kitchen going to look like? What are the cabinets going to look like? If someone, back in the day when everybody was going white, 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 everything white, 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 you saw a lot more 4000K because that's a more neutral white tone, and they wanted that white on white look. Now that you're starting to see the resurgence in natural wood colors in cabinetry again, you're starting to see the trend back towards warm, and you see more 3000K. So yeah, it's a huge variation of what you see in the preferences in that. It's one of my favorite things about traveling around and seeing what people prefer.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the lighting trends, especially as we're seeing, like you said, the wood tones changing, the lighting has to change as well. Um, Debbie asks, can you talk a little bit about appliance lighting?
That question I would need a little more direct information on. I'm not sure specifically about appliance lighting and what that is, or if she's talking about lighting up the appliance itself or the lighting that comes internally in an appliance. I'm not sure I can really speak to that very well. If I
Not a
I will
problem.
say, if I had an appliance cabinet, or if I was lighting this around something like that, typically that's going to be you can put that on a sensor switch. Like if I'm opening up a door or something like that, I would put that on a door sensor switch where you get illumination in there. You can see the appliance and what you're working with. If it was sitting on a countertop, something like that, then under cabinet lighting typically does a good job, especially when it's positioned more towards the front of the cabinet, then it can shine back on the fixtures or the appliances that are underneath it. So I hope that's close to the answer you were looking for there.
Yeah, Debbie, if you're still in the broadcast with us, feel free to try and put in maybe some clarification. We can try and get to that before we end. Moving on to Stephen's question, any suggestions on how to get your customer to invest in a higher end product when they're used to maybe inexpensive versions?
Okay, so this really, I would say you kind of have to demonstrate the benefits of this. I mean, typically there's going to be a look and feel factor of the product when it's a step above the rest. You'll notice. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, right? But like there are some cheap tape lighting products that you can really feel they flex like paper, right? They have a very low. Their internal components are not beefed up. They feel very flimsy. The adhesive is not going to feel very sticky. Things like that. As opposed to something, or as opposed to something more professional, where you'll really feel the heft of the components that are inside there. It won't feel so I guess like I said, floppy is I guess the best word I can choose for it. And then, of course, the final output. So a lot of cheap lighting doesn't go to the extreme of keeping things together. Like one of the big things, we talked about Kelvin temperature. When you see a low quality light, sometimes you can actually see a variation in Kelvin temperature from half of the fixture to the other. You'll see warm and cool spots in the lights and the way they look, and you don't get that cohesiveness of light that you should be looking for. So I always talk to people. Like I said, some people are going to be stuck on it, right? If they've used it, they've had no issues. You can't change everybody's mind. But walking someone through some of the visual differences and the component differences of something that's a step up, and then reassuring them and saying, like, look, this has got, a 5 to 10 year warranty. This is expected to last 50 to 80,000 hours compared to something that may only last you 6 to 8 months.
Perfect. No, I think that's great insight. Karen asks, are all types of lighting approved for installation in a wet location, such as a bathroom, or are there more specific lighting that they should be using in those wet locations?
Right. So they are not, and you should be careful about that. So you can, some lighting when it gets wet will ruin it pretty immediately. So I would look for what's called an IP rating. It's the ingress protection rating. And you want, for water locations, you want IP65 or above. That's going to be what protects you from basically a pressurized jet of water. IP65 is not submersible. You can't just bury it in a pool and expect it to last, but it will hold up to a shower or rain or things like that. It's not going to bother it. IP68 would be your truly submersible underwater lighting.
Perfect. Letty asked, to measure Kelvin, where can you purchase a circadian calculator? Or is there maybe another way for us to measure Kelvin?
So you would probably look for what's called a color meter. A color meter is going to be the tool that will help you determine what the temperature of the light is actually. That. So it basically has an optical sensor that you set it under the light, and it will give you a reading. Another way you can do that is more expensive, but gives you more options, is a tool called a spectrometer. And like I said, that's more expensive, but that will give you more information than just the temperature. It'll give you lumen output and the wavelengths of the light, and there's a lot more information there. That's more than most people need, but it is an option.
Perfect. Chelsea asks, how many power supplies do you need? Is this determined by the layout or max load on transformers? How can we determine how far is too far?
So most lights do have a limitation on how far they can run. Generally, for tape light, at 12 volts, you don't want to run more than 20 to 25 feet. At 24 volts, you don't want to run more than 30 to 35 feet. At the ends of those runs, you'll start to see it dim. That's called voltage drop, where you get to the end of the run and all of a sudden it's not quite as bright as it was at the beginning. But as far as the power supply that goes with that, I would use a design service when you're getting started with something like that and let them kind of help you scope that out. If you've got separate areas, of course you're going to need a power supply for each area when it comes to planning for that. And then generally speaking, the power supply, again, I feel like I'm getting too far in the weeds here, but you asked the question. So a power supply, it has a wattage. Okay, so a 60-watt power supply, the 60 watts is the capacity that it can hold, right? And most good lighting companies will tell you the watt consumption of the lights that are going in there. So say your tape lighting consumes 3 watts per foot and you've got a 60-watt power supply. Now you can calculate how many feet you can put on that one power supply.
Perfect. So it can boil down to just math if needed.
It can boil down to math. That's why design service is so helpful for those situations.
Perfect. You might have already answered this, but I'm seeing a few questions here. If you could explain again what line voltage is, just in layman's terms for us.
Yeah, so line voltage is just basically an interchangeable term for 120 volts. You've got low voltage, which is your 24 volts, and then line voltage, which is your 120. In Europe, it would be 240 volts. So it's just what's coming into the home, basically.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Mary asks, you talked about quality differences. I find that most brands higher end will say 50,000 hours. Can you speak to that? Does 50,000 hours mean anything?
Yeah, so 50,000 hours is like, that is the expectancy of performance of the light before it reaches a certain marker that says this is not high enough quality anymore. It doesn't mean that at 50,000 hours the light is going to burn out. It may mean that it's just half as bright as it was the first day you bought it, that type of thing, because over time, degradation of the product. I would say 50,000 hours should be the minimum expectation for anything LED that you put into the home, because it's not a bulb that you unscrew and replace, right? Most of the time, this is something like, if you've got tape lighting, you're going to need to peel the entire thing out and put it back in. You need those long lifetimes. I would look for 50,000 to 70,000 hours as a standard. And anything above that is lagniappe. It's great.
That's good to know.
That's a Louisiana term for extra.
No, I think that's good to know, especially when people are wondering what the minimum expectation should be for these products. Wendy asked, in troubleshooting flickering, you mentioned it happening at 12 to 24. What did you say about what happens 24 to 120? I think she's referring to voltage.
Okay. Happening at 24 to 120. Okay, I think I understand. So when I say there are 2 ways that you can dim a power supply, right? There's a power supply that is designed to be dimmed on the input side, or the line voltage 120 volt side, where it's basically, if you've got like a Lutron style wall dimmer, the dimming signal is coming into that power supply, and it is built with the components it needs to accept that and understand what the light should look like. There is also a power supply that is designed to dim on the low voltage side. So where you're running 24 volts out of that side, then you've got another controller that that low voltage power is running to, and that is designed to control the lights with 24 volts instead of 120 volts. So when I mention 24 volt side versus 120 volt side, that's what I mean. Either you're dimming into the power supply or you're dimming once you get past the power supply. I hope that explains that.
I think so. Thank you. We'll tackle a few more questions here. We still have them coming in as we're speaking, so I don't think we'll be able to get to everyone's today, but we'll try and get through a few more, Keith, if you have some time with us. Gloria asked, how how to do toe kick lighting on motion sensor? Should they use silicone encased strips?
So I would say that's a good way to do it. Some people will do it with a just a standard tape light. Actually see a lot of people use the linear fixture, which is tape in a channel, and use like a 90-degree fixture that kind of throws a wash of light. If you do something like a tape light and shine it straight down at the floor, it looks nice. But something that's angled, it's going to push light out across the floor a little more, and it just gives a really good look. And so the way you would do that would be you would have your power supply, and then you would have your motion sensor wherever you want to place that. And then from the motion sensor, you just run that to the lights. And so as long as your motion sensor is looking, that's your method of control, if we're boiling it down to those core components.
Perfect. Natalia asked, do your systems have the option of higher lumen output? I've ran into this situation when clients do not have pot lighting or we can't add the primary lighting under the cabinet.
Yes, I mean most companies are going to have a higher output option. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. Many companies will have a range of something from an accent light all the way up to a really bright light. Um, I don't know exactly what your target is or what you're trying to hit. There are lots of ways that you can use lighting creatively to add light to an area that's lacking. I would say if you really want something that's like significant, like 600 lumens and up is where you should look at. 600 lumens per foot, it would be the measure of the light, is what I'm talking about. 600 lumens per foot is a good place to start when you're looking at actually creating lighting out of just pure darkness there.
Amazing. Someone asked about droppage. You mentioned that you can see that as the supply is running out. They asked, can you put a power supply at both ends to avoid that?
It depends on the company. With Task, the answer is yes. I can't speak for everybody, but yes, you can. With most of the low voltage lighting, you can do what's called loop wiring, and that's exactly what you're talking about, where you've got power coming in from both sides of that run to balance out the light. So you can get extra distance doing it that way, if that's what you're asking. Like if you want, like instead of your 30 feet that you can get with normally 24 volt, you really could probably push that to 45 to 50 feet if you're powering it from both sides.
Perfect. And I think we'll end with this question here as a really good segue into our outro. Karen asked, is Task Lighting a manufacturer of lighting components? If so, where are these manufactured? And with that, maybe you just want to give us just an overview of the services that Task provides, just so they understand more about you and your company.
Sure. Yes. So Task is a manufacturer. Task has been around since 1985, based out of Kearney, Nebraska. As of right now, our product mix consists of imported products and then some products that we do here in America. We have our facility in Kearney where we've got a production team. They're making things like linear fixtures, and I didn't speak about it on this call, but our angled power strip products and things, all those are right there, coming right out of Kearney, Nebraska there. And so, yes, there is a mix of import products as well. There are just some things that they just are not, available in the United States. And so we do our best, but there are some things that we do just that way. So, but yeah, as far as Task goes, we've got, everything that I talked about in this presentation is something that Task offers. We have a design services team and everything that follows up with that. Like I said, been around since 1985, so doing this a long time. There's lots of experience across our team. I really appreciate. I was reading all the chat, all the really, really nice comments about our design services team. I think they are the best around, and so it's always great. I want to make sure and share all that with them because they'll really appreciate that. So, yeah, and I'm around too. Like I said, if they want, at least if you guys want to share my contact information, I have no problem with that. I'm always happy to answer questions or guide people or whatever I can do to help.
Yeah, we'll make sure that the questions that we didn't get to, we sent to you, Keith, so you can answer. And similarly, we'll make sure that everyone who attended today has your contact info so they can reach out and ask all of their questions and get connected with your services. You are clearly an expert in your field, Keith, so we appreciate the time in answering some of these nitty-gritty questions. I know we actually appreciate getting in the weeds here, so it was very helpful.
Good. Well, I appreciate the time, and I hope that it was beneficial. And I'm always happy to come back around and do it again.
Perfect. Thank you again, Keith. And thank you again to Hardware Resources for generously sponsoring this month's Design and Business webinar series. Until next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, guys.